Rewind to the weeks and months before the last election. The public service was in an uproar. Unions threatening industrial action over a laundry list of issues. But since then, the change in government, it's settled, or is it just a temporary truce? The issues of promotions, increases, bad customer service, and slow movement haven't magically gone away. It's one of the oldest political ploys, stacking the public service with party supporters. The result, bad attitudes. Or is it all a perception? The public service is now tied to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Public servants are set to be deployed to other countries to represent us abroad. Tonight we go in depth into the public service and the role these folks play locally and in international relations. My guest is the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Public Service, the Honourable Fred Mitchell. Our topic, the state of the public service. You're watching On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break. Every new season of On the Record, we push the limits, venture into unknown territory. We take our cameras into places unseen before. We share the stories and experiences that affect us all. And now it's time for Season 5. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on RTV Cable Channel 212 and streaming live on Facebook on the R News Bahamas page. Welcome back to On the Record. The spotlight is on the public service tonight. We have as our guest for the very first time in this setting. He's a veteran politician, one of few returning ministers in this new administration, and a former journalist, which I think some people forget at times. Minister of Foreign Affairs and Public Service, the Honourable Fred Mitchell, is here this evening. So welcome to On the Record. Good to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure being there.
We're talking about the state of the public service. Now, Minister, a lot is being said about the public service. Even you, at times, expressed your frustration with certain aspects. How far are you now with sorting out things like promotions and the workers who were overdue for certain permanent and pensionable positions?
This is a very difficult proposition to deal with. I'm not sure entirely what the reasons are. I suspect some of them are financial. Others may be political, but I suspect it's mainly financial. But we have a very able, aggressive, smart Minister of State who is busy trying to tackle these problems on the day-to-day basis, and that's Pia Glover-Roll. Mm-hmm. And she's set about trying to get these problems resolved. The most vexing, of course, was the question of the immigration officers who had been in their positions as trainees since 2014 in some cases and are just now being made permanent and pensionable. Now, the reason I say it's maybe financial is because once you become permanent and pensionable, you become a charge. Your pension becomes a charge on the Bahamas government. And there's no funding for that, which is set aside. So it comes out of the consolidated fund. So every time you add someone to the permanent and pensionable, you have this unfunded mandate which you have to fulfill at the end of that person's career. And that makes that an expensive proposition to take on. We've been talking about this since I first became a minister in the years 2002 to 2007. There was a Social Services Commission, I believe it was headed by Alfred Stewart, and they recommended at that time that we needed to go to a contributory pension for new employees of the public service. Nothing done, and we're still at the point where we're dealing with that issue.
Why would something like that, though, not be implemented, considering, as you would have said, the burden that becoming permanent and pensionable places now on the consolidated fund and by extension on government expenses? But what would prevent something like that from happening? I mean, in the private sector, we contribute to our pension. It's matched in some places, but we contribute to it. Why wouldn't something like that be done in government?
Again, I don't really have an answer. I think it in part is political, because every time you raise it, there's pushback from the unions on the issue. I think now the union leadership has come around, most of them mainly, to the fact that this is becoming such an expensive proposition that at least going forward for new employees, you need to put in place a contributory pension. There's no question that that must come. And hopefully with Mrs. Glover Roll, we'll get that done during this term.
You've mentioned her twice, and she is on my list of questions here. Having that Minister of State in the person of Pia Glover Roll, is that helping to speed things up in satisfying the demand for all of these things that are overdue? And against the backdrop of some of the criticisms that those in opposition, even the public, would have levied against the administration when all these ministers of state were appointed, there was this criticism that you have this large cabinet. Again, why do we need these ministers of state when you have a substantive minister?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, it is important for the government to put in place a system of training for people in the business of being politicians and public figures. So it is advisable, if you can afford it, and we can afford it, to have a situation where for at least a time there's someone who's had the experience before, who's able to superintend the work of that person who is the Minister of State. Also, the portfolios are quite large, and therefore you do need the assistance to carry out some of the day-to-day functions. I have no doubt at some point, and I think she has a long life ahead of her in politics, that she'll become a full minister at some point, and that she'll be able to handle it quite ably. But even when she becomes the full minister, she's going to have a parliamentary secretary or a minister of state to help with the day-to-day work of the ministry. There are some 20,000 employees of the public service. That's the largest single employer by far in the Bahamas. And this takes a lot of work. The rules are very complex. That's part of the reason why everything is really so slowed down. For example, the mantra which people don't like to hear is, it's with the Public Service Commission. Now, our Constitution set up a system where the people who are actually hired, promoted, and transferred and disciplined are actually disciplined by an independent body called the Public Service Commission. The problem is that they don't have the staffing and they don't have the capacity to deal with the numbers that they're now dealing with. And so it is tremendously slowed down. Mrs. Glover Roll is tackling that problem. And hopefully we'll get on top of that, which is to increase the capacity of the Commission to process these things. And so by the end of the term, there should be there should be less of a problem with dealing with those complaints about time, for example.
You, as Minister, are tasked with not just the public service, but foreign affairs as well. Just in terms of her ascension to full status as a minister or someone else, do you foresee the public service having its own ministry that's standalone, and could that be in a Pia Glover role?
Well, she certainly has a capacity to do so, but I don't want to be encroaching or trespassing on the territory of the Prime Minister. That's entirely his judgment. But certainly she has the capacity to do so. And there have been ministers dedicated to the public service entirely before, or I think the last time it was added to the National Insurance Board. So, there's some other things that can be added to it. But there's no question that attention needs to be focused on the public service, because Michael Manley when I was in my other life as a journalist. He lost the general election in Jamaica in 1980 to Seaga. And I went to see him and asked him, what were the issues connected with your governance? And he said that one of the issues was that the public administration, meaning the public service, simply, he said, sagged under the weight of all the changes we were asking them to make. And they just didn't have the capacity to keep up with it. And I fixed that in my mind a long time ago. And I said to Prime Minister Christie, to Prime Minister Davis, to a lesser extent to Prime Minister Pinling, that unless we fix the public administration, all the changes that you want to make will be dead in the water because of capacity issues. So we must work on it. We must fix it. When the people of the country vote for a government and that government takes over, that government ought to be able to depend on, if I give my instructions, if I give my directions, those directions are carried out with dispatch. And right now, we're not in that situation.
And that brings me squarely to my next question. Why is it that successive governments cannot seem to get this notion that when instructions are given or when something needs to be done, that it is done in a timely manner? I mean, things in the public service just seem to drag on forever and ever. Is it an issue of a lack of ability, overstaffing? Have you been able to really wrap your mind around what causes these delays within the public service?
Well, look, when I became Public Service Minister 2002, 2007, and I looked around the landscape and I said to myself, I have a very modest ambition. And that modest ambition I announced was I would try and get the telephones of public offices to be answered after the second ring. Complete failure. Complete failure. Complete failure. Just couldn't get it done. It was just one thing after the next. And, little things like I go up to Grand Bahama and I'm inspecting the passport office and the employees come to me and they complain that they can't get tea and coffee, for example, on the job. So I say to the permanent secretary, let's get tea and coffee for the employees on the job. And the permanent secretary says to me, sorry, there's no line item for tea and coffee on the job. Now, when I look down the line items, there's a line item for tea and coffee for visitors, but there's none for the employees, right? So, I mean,
sorry.
So I said, but
I laugh because these are the kinds of stories you hear over and over.
Over and over,
and from someone who has worked in the private sector for so long, that is a simple fix.
Yeah, that's what I thought
okay,
too.
well, let's make it available to the staff.
Yeah.
Why seemingly can't we get these basic, simple things done, which to me are just common sense things?
Well, I think part of it is that not everybody's on the same page, and I've said this, even on the campaign trail, that actually when you get into a cabinet, sometimes, you all campaign on one theme, for example, but when you get to the cabinet and the decision is about to be taken, you actually find that some people don't believe the same things you believe. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's not such an important item. Secondly, within the service itself, many people have described, I know Felix Bethel, the late lecturer at the University of the Bahamas, used to always say that the third political party in the Bahamas is actually the public service. because you have the FNM, the PLP, and the public service.
Yes, sir.
And so they actually run things. Mm-hmm. And you have to be very skillful as a minister to know how to navigate through the arcane procedures of the public service. Those procedures are there for a reason. They're there to protect the public funds so that public funds are not wasted and squandered. But it can get to the point where it's just overbearing and it is actually a burden. So you have the situation where our passport office, for example, a young man from the Foxhill constituency is sitting in the passport office and he's been there for 3 hours and he only wishes to apply for the renewal of the passport for his son. And he says to me, why do I have to sit in here for 3 hours just to be called to this window? And again, I don't have the answer, but I know that the answer is in fact in management. It is in training, and that's obviously the solution.
Minister, we've got to go to a break soon, but I wanted to bring this up. and I don't know how we address it, but the public service, let's be honest, is filled with many of the my minister sent to me or my MP sent to me. Successive governments and those in authority have used the public service as a place to give supporters and people jobs. And these people are not necessarily qualified. They don't have the know-how, and some of them just want a job. And so now, you know, as you would have mentioned, the gentleman from Foxhill is now burdened with having to sit there for 3 hours because somebody seemingly who my minister or my MP sent me, you know, is not doing their job.
Again, I wouldn't pin it necessarily on that. And, you know, we've had long discussions about the size of the public service and the size of the private sector. You know, there's people want these jobs in the public sector because they are they are long-term and you have tenure.
They're safe.
Right. I thought myself that one of the things we ought to do, of course, is to pass national pension legislation, which would allow portability of pensions from employer to employer. Because the real issue I think people think is that at the end of my job at the public service, I have a pension. So my employment or my post-employment life is secure because I have some income. And I was thinking, if we started a national pension legislation so that every employer, in fact, provides a pension across the board, that would eliminate that issue. The second thing is, of course, is governments have to make the economy more dynamic, because if the economy is dynamic, then people will migrate from the public service into the private sector, and I think that might help as well. So it's a vexing problem. I also think, and you know, I'm being theoretical here, that part of the issue is the culture of the country. It's a culture of being too deliberative. Because the issues of timeliness also apply in the private sector. The example I use, for example, is try to get a loan from a bank here in the Bahamas. You apply, you provide all the information, and they can't give you an answer within 6 months. It's just ridiculous. Try to open a bank account here. It is just ridiculous. And all of these sort of things tend to show that there's some cultural issues which we have to address at the level of education.
Good point. That's a good point and place for us to take our first break in the show. We are discussing the state of the public service with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Public Service. We'll be back right after this. Every new season of On the Record, we push the limits, venture into unknown territory. We take our cameras into places unseen before. We share the stories and experiences that affect us all. And now it's time for Season 5. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on RTV Cable Channel 212 and streaming live on Facebook on the R News Bahamas page. Welcome back. You're watching On the Record. My guest tonight is the Honourable Fred Mitchell. He's the Minister responsible for Foreign Affairs and the Public Service. Minister, although there have been marked improvements, people still complain bitterly about the attitude of some of the public servants. Is there anything being done in terms of the customer service training or any incentives geared towards curbing this behaviour or even changing it culturally? Because I think sometimes you look at these kinds of things and it's so rampant, not just in the public service, but our customer service sometimes across the board, it's different, if I can use that word to be polite. But is there anything being done in terms of training and incentivizing people to do better?
Well, I've had really long discussions with both the Permanent Secretary and Mrs. Glover Roll, who's the Minister of State, about this. I think they're very deeply concerned about it. So the training programs are being implemented to try and deal with this question of the element of public service. Again, I suspect much of it is cultural. One of the observations I make, for example, is you go to a restaurant in this country and people ask you for various things, and it comes off as if they have to speak like a second language almost, because that's not the language where they actually use at home. So I think maybe some of the formalism causes a problem, because we speak to one another in a kind of very direct fashion when we're with one another. But of course, speaking to people in the context of a formal office is a bit different. So there's some of that. So the training is obviously an answer. But, and it must, I think, fundamentally say that people have a right to the service which they're asking for, and they have a right to receive that service courteously and receive it with all the dispatch that you can muster. I've tried in my own political career to make that axiomatic for my conduct. It is difficult because sometimes you get really upset by the way people speak and talk to you, but then you say to yourself, look, if you, for example, show up at a social services window and you need assistance, you are depending on the state. You are already on a knife's edge when you show up. Mm-hmm. So someone asks you the wrong question or it's perceived in the wrong way, you just go off the handle. And I think people have to understand that stuff like that you just ignore and deal with what the central problem or issue is. So that takes a lot of patience and training, I suspect.
Well, you know, it would seem to me, though, Minister, that's, you know, we need to address this from a national perspective, how we deal with each other, how we talk to each other, how we behave. I know this is a little bit off topic, but, you know, you're right, it's not just in the public service, and then sometimes we as customers, we come with a bad attitude. And I'm saying all that to get to this point. I mean, at a political level, don't politicians also have a responsibility? Sometimes I watch the House of Assembly or I watch the discourse between the politicians and I say to myself, well, how do we expect our people to behave differently when our politicians behave like this?
Yeah, I mean, that's always a convenient sort of thing, but I remember the Speaker of the House of Representatives, I think they call themselves in Australia, came here once at a CPA conference. And he said, you know, look, we get this criticism all the time about the conduct in the House and the conduct in the Senate. But, you know, it is the freest forum in the country. And yes, the debate gets heated. It's the level of the democracy. And I'm not so concerned about that, and I understand the point that's being made. My answer to that is, once we're not taking guns and shooting one another in the place, no problem. And once we're not punching one another, you know, no issue. Words, that's a different thing. We can always deal with that. But the more serious point is, yes, I think that at all levels, and I think it begins with education, from the tiniest up to high school and university level, is this question of courtesy, civility in our lives, both private and public. And I think that has to translate itself into the service which you deliver for the public service.
You know, we've often heard it, and we're going to move on right now. You can disagree without being disrespectful.
Yeah. And
I think we need to get to that point. Besides the overdue promotions, there were some promotions that were given prior to last year's elections that came into question. In fact, you withdrew many of them to review them. If you could give us an idea of some of your findings, and were these promotions politically motivated, as you would have, as some on your side would have charged?
Look, I take this philosophical position. Up to the time that the election is done and the parliamentary commissioner has pronounced that the regime has changed and a new prime minister is sworn in, the man who has the authority in his hands is the previous prime minister. So up to the point of the transition, they have the authority to carry out whatever powers the Constitution allows them to carry out. What we said is that given the pace with which things were carried out prior to the election, we wanted to have a look at whether those were lawfully carried out. So once those are lawful, we can't set those aside. there was one example where one of the permanent secretaries told us that they were given an instruction on the day of the election to make someone permanent and pensionable. And that official refused to carry out the instructions on the grounds that, given the fact of where we were, election day itself, that would not be an appropriate thing to do. But of course, that's a judgment call for that officer or official to make. There's nothing which actually prevents that from happening. So that's the way the law operates. While there are some examples, I'm sure, where we would have disagreed with the decisions taken, once those decisions are lawful, they have to be supported.
But then you rewind to, the previous administration, when they came in 2017, there were the same charges that under, the former administration you were a part of, the same things were done. And from the public perspective, we sit there and we go, well, every 5 years we hear the same argument. What do we do to stop this? How do we at least give the appearance that these things aren't politically motivated?
I don't think you can actually stop it. I don't think you can, because as I said, the Constitution gives the authority up to the time the person is sworn in, the next person is sworn in. So unless you have legislation, and I'm not sure the legislation would be constitutional to do so, I think it probably has to do with public education and a prime minister who is sensitive to the fact that I am in an election period and it's simply inappropriate to do so. Well, good luck with that one.
So it seemed like it comes all down to the Prime Minister and his either allowing it or not allowing it.
Right. I think that's the way the law currently reads. Now, a number of us have talked about what we call as a transition act, which would prohibit such conduct, let's say 3 months before an election period. But of course, you have to be very careful, because in our country, elections can be called at any point in time. We've talked about fixed date for elections. That's also a difficult proposition in the system that we have. And one of the reasons we find ourselves in the position that we are now is because the country, remember, the country's budget system is 12 months from July the 1st to June the 30th. So all of the systems, the payment systems, the money flow, the cash flow, all of that is predicated on the fact that you're in that cycle. And then you go and call a general election 1 quarter into that cycle. It just upsets the whole apple cart. So the new people come in, they have different priorities, and it takes a while for the whole system to shift behind those priorities.
Very quickly as we go into the break, how far along are you in sorting all of that out in either releasing those holds or dealing with those promotions that were put in place? How far along?
Well, I think we are still trying to process the immigration promotions. Customs promotions are still outstanding. The financial officers, for example, are aggrieved. We've been able to settle the nurses, the payments which are owed to the nurses. So we're trying to get at it, step by step. But I can tell you there's a great deal of impatience. My telephone is overwhelmed with calls and notes about not being promoted and not being, or I haven't gotten my transfer, or I'm not on the permanent and pensionable. You have this group of people who work for local government, for example, who are not government employees, but they've been treated as everything but government employees. So there's a long list of things to do. We can, try and chip away at it, but it is quite a task.
We should have called this show The Realities of Governance.
Yeah, but I mean, that's what we signed up for, so it's not a complaint.
Well, I'm glad you said it. That's what you signed up for. I think
no issue.
Sometimes politicians forget that.
That's
what you signed up for.
Issue.
So we're going to take a quick break. You're watching On the Record. We are back right after this. Every new season of On the Record, we push the limits. Venture into unknown territory. We take our cameras into places unseen before. We share the stories and experiences that affect us all. And now it's time for Season 5. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on RTV Cable Channel 212 and streaming live on Facebook on the R News Bahamas page. Welcome back to On the Record. My guest tonight, the Honourable Fred Mitchell. He's the Minister for the Public Service and Foreign Affairs. We continue to talk about the public service. So, sir, your party won by a landslide in the last election. Since then, there have been pockets of grumbling from supporters about not being placed fast enough in various posts. Also from people being left in key positions who they feel should have been removed after the election. On countless occasions, you have gone to the public asking these people to be patient. Even in January, or would have said that you're working toward rectifying all of this. As it stands, where are you in this exercise? And I think we addressed it a bit going into the last break. These are the realities of governance. There's a lot of pressure to do some things. How do you balance all of that, and how do you make these things happen for these people who have been loyal to the party and to individuals?
Well, the first thing is you can only do what you can do, and that's been my axiomatic for me. You can't do what you can't do. Of course, you do counsel patience. So one of the things that's always said is that when the FNM came to power, they just fire people. And the PLP is just taking too long to do this. Of course, we forget that part of the reason the FNM lost is because they did precisely that. So the leader of our party takes a more sensitive approach to this. I mean, this is a small country, and people are related one to the next, and you actually don't know who you're touching when you touch one person. I never forget talking to the late Sir Lyndon Pindling as a young man, that he found out that Wenzel Granger, who was then Deputy Commissioner of Police and Director of Immigration, I told him he was married to my father's sister, and he just sort of bolted back in his chair and he said, boy, in this country you just have to be careful what you say because you don't know who's related to who. So that's one issue. And as fast as you say you're making a decision which is going to remove somebody from employment, you'll get a call from their first cousin who happens to be a stalwart counselor to say, well, that's my grandniece and I know she's F&M, but I want you to be sure because she has 3 children and you have to take care of it. So you get some of that. So there's that issue. Secondly, I would say that you have to also understand that although the Progressive Liberal Party won the election, the Progressive Liberal Party's base could not cause us to win the election. So essentially, when you look at the way, if you're a psephologist and you're looking at disaggregating how elections turn out, you would say that roughly 40% of the people are F&M and 40% of the people are PLP. And in the middle, there's this group which swings from one section to the next. And so when you're running an election campaign, you're actually playing to the middle. You have to get your base out, there's no question, and we lost our base in the election before. We got our base out this time, but we needed, in order to succeed, particularly since the turnout was low, we needed to have those people in the middle support us in order to win. Now, many of them were public servants who on the face of it were F&M, I assume, or people would think they're F&M. But they helped behind the scenes. So you don't know who helped. The leader went to people, and people came to see him in various groups. And so all of those have to be reckoned with. Those people have to be reckoned with afterwards. So there's a lot of that which is going on. Having said that, the pie is ample. The country has resources enough to be able to fulfill all of the requirements and needs and demands which people have. And that's slowly unfolding. We've been able to tackle, for example, the moratorium on licenses in road traffic. That will ease some of the pressure, I think, and some of the demands. The business of putting people on boards, I think that's slowly unfolding as well. So it takes a little time. It's been 4 months. I was hoping by March, which would be just another month to go, that much of this will quiet down. But, Jerome, the problem is this. When you look at the statistics in this country, I think it was about, the figure was under 10% when we first did the poverty survey in this country, I think shortly after we came to office or just before. And when the Free National Movement left office, the poverty rate, that is people who are living below the poverty line, had moved from under 10% to 47%. And if that is correct, that means 1 in every 2 people in the country are living below the poverty line. And it reflects in the demands which people make, the contracts that they need, the fact that they simply need jobs, that they don't have food to eat, they can't buy school uniforms for the children, can't bury the dead. It is simply overwhelming. And during the pandemic, the way the government dealt with it was transfer payments, which you had to do because, of course, the economy was shut down. And that's one of the reasons why we said, look, you've got to open up this economy, because we don't want to be in a position where we say the operation succeeded, but the patient died. There's no point in that. You have to have a situation where the livelihood of people continues. Otherwise, the country would just go down the tubes. So what's at work is poverty is at work, and we have to solve that underlying problem. In 2018, the central bank did a survey, and the survey said that of people living under, who are making under $30,000 a year in this country, 50% of them said at the end of the month they could not make ends meet, and they had to borrow from family and friends, or from the bank, or from loan sharks in order to get it past the month. These are just astounding statistics, and they have to be addressed. And they have to be addressed. You know, there was this very frank discussion in the House of Assembly this week about the issue of taxes and whether there's a difference of opinion between what Simon Wilson, the financial secretary, said and what the Prime Minister said on the issue of taxes. And the Prime Minister says taxes is not on the that's not something we want to put on the table as a last resort. Simon Wilson simply said that new measures have to be taking place. And one of the new measures that has already taken place is the valuation of land. You have people who are fabulously wealthy in this country who are getting clean away with paying no taxes to the country, or too little of their of taxes to this country. And the country is starving because the tax base keeps shrinking. And we have to have a national conversation about this, because without revenue, you can't go forward.
So not necessarily a new tax, but revisiting a tax.
Well, Simon Wilson said tax measures. So I explained to the opposition, one of those tax measures is, in fact, has already been done. The revaluation of these wealthy people who live in our country on these wealthy properties and are not paying what the true value of the tax should be.
But I have heard others complaining vehemently, people who are not fabulously rich, complaining that they have seen their property tax increase exponentially, 2-3 times what it was.
I think that there are appeals procedures, and I don't know the particulars of those people who have been affected by it. But you know, there's room and maneuver to look at those things. But the general proposition or general point I'm making is that the wealthier you are, you should pay your fair share to support the country you live in.
I want to go back, though, to something we touched on, and it was, you mentioned the firing of people and things of that nature. I always wonder, if you are a qualified Bahamian, if you are doing a good job, if you are productive, whether you were hired by the former administration or not, why does it matter? When are we going to get to that point where you say, if Fred Mitchell is a good worker, if he is servicing this contract, if he's doing his job, regardless of if he was hired under the FNM or PLP, why should he not be allowed to continue to work? And I think that is where a lot of this comes from. You know, I'm not saying that there aren't political appointees, and it happens when a government comes in, people who are brought in for political purposes will move out, and that should be an automatic movement. But you have instances where people who are qualified, who have no political allegiance, may have been brought in, but because you came in under the administration, the previous, suddenly you're under the spotlight.
Well, a couple of things there. The first is to talk about political level appointees. And this, I just know this from my experience with the Foreign Service, when the government changes, those at political level should resign.
And agreed, I think, definitely, yeah.
Forthwith. Now, there's another class of people in the Foreign Service who were brought in under contracts, and they were brought in because the salary scale for people in the Foreign Service, in the permanent and pensionable group, simply is just not acceptable in my view. And you would say that those are also in the political category. But I think that having looked at them as minister, they seem qualified and all the rest of it, and it's been agreed to roll over those contracts. And I think you're absolutely correct. The problem I have is that people who ought to know better, who are up at the top of these jobs, that are entirely politically, are trying to stench to say, no, I shouldn't go, I shouldn't go. But that's our system. That's the way it's evolved. And I think, that's not going to change. When the next administration comes in, and we hope that that's far down the road, they have the right to choose who their advisors would be. And I would not feel safe having people who have allegiances to the other group to be around me giving me advice.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
And I think, we see it in other countries, for instance, because we always look to the United States. I mean, whenever a new president, a new administration comes in, there is a full cleaning of the house, which should happen.
Right.
Because you're right. If I'm loyal to you and that administration changes, the relationship is going to change. Obviously, I'm not going to have your best interest at heart if I'm in the position. So I think it's those, it's not those positions, I think, where rightfully people are agreed, but there are other instances where people are let go or moved just because they would have been brought in under an administration.
Well, I mean, we just settled the case of the urban renewal workers,
right,
who all dismissed when the Free National Movement administration came in 2017. And every time I raised this matter with the Minister of Labor, they would say, oh, well, the contracts expired and we just didn't renew them, okay? But it turns out that the Industrial Tribunal or the courts thought otherwise. So we had to settle the debt to those people, and they should have the opportunity to come back. Similarly with the Gaming Board. People who were the Gaming Board, they actually took the government to court, got a court order saying they should be reinstated, ignored. The PLP is not going to do that. But we do insist that those people at the political level have to resign. They have to resign. That's the system, and it has to change. But as Myles LaRota said, Myles LaRota, who is the minister responsible for national insurance, and he got up and he said, look, people on these minimum wage jobs, that's not us. And the record shows that that's not us. We don't dismiss people at that level. It is not fair and it's not right.
And hopefully, this in some ways will be the ending of it, because it happens.
Well, what would be the end of it, I think, is if the Bahamian people give us another opportunity, another 5 years. Because the problem, I think, is the country has not been well served by this jumping from 5 years here, 5 years there, 5 years here, 5 years there. I'm sorry, it just hasn't worked. We need the 2 terms.
Yeah.
And hopefully, one of the reasons why I have the jobs that I had before, what I said to the Prime Minister, is to avoid a learning curve, so that part of what I do is to make sure that the party continues to survive. Because what has happened in the past is you get so caught up in governance, and this is Paul Adley was a minister in Sir Lyndon's government, and he lost to Frank Watson in the original Carmichael constituency, I think is what it was called. Mm-hmm. And he was saying to me, I thought I was doing such a great job as a minister, and but unless you pay attention to the politics, and
that's a question I often ask ministers. How do you balance the work of minister with the needs of constituents that have to be met?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why we have this standing committee of the House now, because I think incumbency ought to mean something, and I think that all of the things that are necessary to support the work of a member of Parliament ought to be supplied by the government, so that member of Parliament can do the work which is demanded by the constitutional office which he or she has.
Makes sense. So we have been talking quite a bit about the public service. When we come back, we are going to begin our discussion on the other part of your ministry. So stay with us. You are watching On the Record. We're going to be back right after this. Every new season of On the Record, we push the limits, venture into unknown territory. We take our cameras into places unseen before. We share the stories and experiences that affect us all. And now it's time for Season 5. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on RTV Cable Channel 212 and streaming live on Facebook on the R News Bahamas page. Welcome back. The Honourable Fred Mitchell, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and the Public Service, joins us as our guest. Tonight we're talking about the state of the public service. Minister, we spent a lot of time on the public service, but I do want to shift gears now and talk about foreign affairs, which is a substantive part of your position and your role. Let's jump right in. Much ado was made about the recent trip to Dubai. Many Bahamians felt that it was unnecessary. While you were there, you signed a memorandum of understanding with Emirates, as well as during the Prime Minister's time he signed a memorandum of understanding as well for training, etc. Tell us how important are international trips like this? I think because people, they see you going, they see the things happening, and they wonder and they ask in the public domain, you know, why is it necessary for us to go and do these kinds of trips? Why do we need to take a delegation? What's the point of all this? Can't they have these conversations over the phone or by Zoom?
I suppose they could, but, 200 Bahamians work and live in Dubai. And, you only have to have a call at midnight and somebody says, I've lost my passport, or, I'm in jail in Dubai, or, I'm in hospital in Dubai. What do I do? And parents on this end are frantic. So you have to have some presence, and many people have not heard of the Bahamas at all. So the whole question of foreign affairs is to make sure that the country has an imprint across the world. I said that what I believe is that the Bahamian passport, when any Bahamian goes to another country and holds up that passport, I want people to say, Bahamas, pass by. And that's the reason, really.
One of the things that struck me, and I was there reporting, and I didn't even think about it until after it came up, was the fact that you didn't need a visa to enter. I mean, you presented your passport and you walked straight through.
That's because 10 years ago or more, we signed a visa abolition agreement with the Emirates, and so as a result of that, their citizens can come here visa-free, we can go there visa-free.
Why is that important? Why is something like that important? Or what are the benefits of that, I should say?
Of the visa-free?
Yeah.
I think that travel is complicated as it is, and it's simply easier if you don't need a visa to do so. That means anytime you want to move, you can move. And as I say, 200 Bahamians, probably more, actually live and work in Dubai. There are at least 6 or 7 pilots who fly for the Emirates Airlines, and this is a very sophisticated operation. So there are Bahamians across the world. I remember when I went to Singapore, there are 20 Bahamians working in Singapore.
I remember going to Singapore and meeting quite a few friends.
Sure,
I didn't even
they
know
were
were
recruited from Atlantis here.
Right.
They went over there to work in the aquarium at Atlantis. So we're all over the place. So their government should be where they are. That's it. Plus, when we started this initiative for the Middle East, we said this. There are two regions that have surplus capital. One is China. The other is the Middle East. We had good relations with the Chinese, but no outreach to the Middle East. So we decided step by step to start with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, and with the Emirates. We managed the Emirates and Qatar, but the Saudi Arabia, we're just now getting around to it. And of course, we have an ambassador designate now to Kuwait as well, who's a young Bahamian, and I think when the name is announced, people will be surprised by this. But he's made a name for himself across the Middle East by simply going out as a Bahamian citizen and getting involved in the work in the Middle East. But the Bahamas is in the business of shopping for capital. We need investment in this country. So there are various agreements that have to be signed. What's outstanding is the asset protection agreement with the Emirates, which says basically we won't nationalize the property of their business people if they come and invest here, and then the double taxation, which is that we won't tax their citizens as you won't have two sets of taxes being taken out in this country if their businessmen come here and make money.
I want to talk about your consul generals who have been deployed around the world. One of the consequences of a change in government is that a lot of those foreign postings, the majority, if not all of them, are changed at the very top level. You would have set out a list. How are those individuals settling?
Well, we've not actually published a list. A list has sort of leaked out. But, you know, until the Prime Minister actually makes the announcement, I'd prefer not to say what their names are. But we have offices in Atlanta, Miami, Washington, D.C., New York. There probably will be one coming in Los Angeles. Houston will be upgraded. And Denver, if you could believe that, the Bahamian citizens, a number of Bahamian citizens who live in Denver, of all places. Then you've got Toronto, where you have all the Bahamian students. You've got a High Commission, which is coming in Jamaica, and High Commission in Trinidad. You've got China, you've got Cuba, you've got the UK, you've got Geneva, you've got Brussels. And all of those have seen changes in the heads of mission. And we expect that within the hesitation, at least for the heads of mission, is that the countries that they're going to, they have to agree to the name before you announce it. You know, we ran into this issue with the Americans the last time. I don't want to get into that issue. So we're just waiting on those things. And once that's done, the Prime Minister will make a formal announcement of those who are taking over. Speaking
of Americans, any word on whether we will get an ambassador?
No, there is no word.
What continues to be the issue?
The issue is we're just not on the radar. I can say it no less bluntly than that. They got a number of ambassadors through at Christmas time, but given the makeup of the Senate in the United States, it's very difficult for the present administration to get anything more than people or persons who are critical to there. And I guess the Bahamas is not critical.
How does that affect relations? Or does it affect relations, not having
it doesn't really, because much of the work between the two states is really on a technical level. The security cooperation, the pre-clearance facility, the anti-drug efforts, and the support for our social security, those kinds of things, and in some sense also education, visas. So those are all technical things. What I do think, though, is one of the irritants in the relationship, and I just brought this to the attention of Brian Nichols, who's the senior person in charge of the Western Hemisphere, is the irritant in the relationship is the way visas are handled by the embassy in the country. There are still, in my view, too many complaints from Bahamians who feel that the decisions are arbitrary and prejudicial about the granting or otherwise of visas to travel to the United States. I've said to U.S. officials that if the 400,000 of us in the Bahamas chose to move to the United States next week, it wouldn't make a difference to the population of the United States. So this jumping through hoops to get a visa to go to the U.S. Is, in my view, unnecessary and unfair.
What do you think is at the basis of all of this, though? I mean, why do you think that as you say, people think that it's arbitrary and selective?
Well, it probably is in fact arbitrary because under their law, the decision by the consular officer is a subjective decision. It's not an objective decision. So even if you fulfill all the criteria, if the consular officer, it appears, wakes up on the wrong side of the bed, says, sorry.
So if I just look at you and say, you know what, I don't like you, I don't like how you presented yourself.
Right.
No visa.
That's right. That's right. I mean, if you judge by, when you say something is a subjective decision,
sure.
that could be. And the other thing, too, is that people think that the Minister of Foreign Affairs can somehow bring pressure or influence to bear on these decisions. We cannot, and we do not have the ability to do so. In fact, when we make inquiries, we're basically told, butt out, you know, it's a private matter. We don't say in advance whether people are able to get visas or not get visas. The person simply has to apply and stand on his or her own 2 feet. What I've said to people is my experience with the U.S. system is that if you keep at them, eventually they relent. That's the best we can do in the circumstances. But the reason why I speak about it publicly is because I want to sensitize the U.S. in their public capacities that this is an irritant in the relationship and that they need to address it in a more sensitive fashion.
So I think that's a good place for us to end. I mean, I hear people complain from time to time, but I did not realize that it was as arbitrary as that. So very interesting. Hopefully we get an ambassador soon. Who knows?
Yes, right, and that's the point I was getting to. So I think where it would make a difference, because when John Rood was here, for example, as ambassador, I was able to say, well, you know, this case or that case, and I think they brought the sensitivity. They couldn't direct the consular officer what to do, but I think they could get a fair hearing, so to speak, or a rehearing of a matter that was particularly difficult.
Sure. Minister, I just want to say that we appreciate having you as our guest on the show, and we're looking forward to having you back again at some point. Our discussion tonight has been quite informative, and hopefully we put a lot of things in perspective. Our topic tonight, the state of the public service. We talked a little bit about foreign affairs as well. We'd like to thank our guest, the minister here, for coming on. And just before we go, we want to wish our Kriston Saunders, we know him as Kanye, a very happy belated birthday. Kriston is an intricate part of our technical team here. He celebrated his birthday on Monday. Also to our technical supervisor, Valdez Ferguson, who's celebrating today. February is a great month for birthdays. You can guess why. Anyway, and Udesha, I understand, who is a part of our social media team. I tell you, the list is very long. I feel like it's community announcements. As always, thank you to my technical and production staff. Until next time, I'm Jerome Sawyer, your host. Have a good one.